I wondered many times why people like so much detective novels. It is, first of all, because they embody better than any other genre the real essence of a novel, which is expectation, the stimulation of the forecasts on the part of the reader. In this sense, it is the novel par excellence. There have been many ideological interpretations by which a detective novel, by opening a crisis and installing an original murder and then making the detective to solve the riddle and to win, is a sort of myth that tells again and again the restoration of the order. But I think that there is another more profound reason why, is that the essence of a detective novel is a quest. I want to know the, capital T, the answer. In the detective novel, the answer is who done it. But it is the essence of any religion and of any philosophy. Who done it?
That was Umberto Eco, professor of semiology, theoretician of narrative, and author of a best-selling detective story of his own. And as he says, a successful story is one that makes the reader or the listener want to know what happens next. And that's the basic structuring device of all narrative. What else holds our attention? What makes us keep turning the pages of a novel except curiosity about the outcome? How is it going to end? Indeed, that's the principle of all detective fiction, perhaps the only principle. And in that sense, all novels are detective novels. And Hard Times is no exception. It's actually got a detective element in it. Who robbed Mr. Bounderby's bank? It's got a comically inept detective, Mrs. Sparsit, nosing about for clues as she tracks the progress of Louisa's love affair. But more generally, how does Dickens organize and control narrative expectation in the novel? Through language, through the actual words and blocks of words that he uses to set scenes, to describe characters, to comment on them, and to provide them with dialogue. We're going to investigate this process by looking at a short scene from the beginning of Hard Times, the scene in which we first meet Mr. Bounderby and Mrs. Gradgrind. The situation is that Mr. Bounderby has arrived at Stone Lodge, the home of his friend Mr. Gradgrind, and while he's waiting for him to turn up, he engages Mrs. Gradgrind in small talk, and he tells her it's his birthday. We're not going to produce an actual dramatization, so the actors aren't in Dickensian costume. There's no scenery, as you can see, only one or two pieces of furniture, because what we want you to concentrate on is the language. Using just the dialogue that Dickens presents us with, here's one possible interpretation of that scene.
Oh, I hadn't a shoe to my foot. And as to a stocking, I didn't know such a thing by name. I passed the day in a ditch and the night in a pigsty. That's the way I spent my 10th birthday. Not that a ditch was new to me, for I was born in a ditch.
I hope it was a dry ditch.
No, as wet as a sop. A foot of water in it.
Enough to give a baby cold.
Cold. I was born with inflammation of the lungs. And of everything else, I believe, that was capable of inflammation. For years, Ma'am, I was one of the most miserable wretches ever seen. I was so sickly that I was always moaning and groaning. I was so ragged and dirty that you wouldn't have touched me with a pair of tongs. How I fought through it, I don't know. I was determined, I suppose. I've been a determined character in later life, and I suppose I was then. Well, here I am, Mrs. Gradgrind, anyhow, and no one to thank for my being here but myself.
Bounderby and Mrs. Gradgrind, they come over as quite sympathetic and interesting characters, don't they? And that's because dialogue on its own is open to more than one interpretation. But in a novel, dialogue isn't on its own. There's always a narrative context. And as any reader of Hard Times discovers very quickly, the narrator is part of that context. Indeed, he dominates it. He's almost a character in his own right, so emphatic and recognizable are his comments. Here's his description of Mr. Bounderby.
He was a rich man, banker, merchant, manufacturer, and whatnot. A big, loud man with a stare and a metallic laugh. A man made out of a coarse material which seemed to have been stretched to make so much of him. A man with a great puffed head and forehead, swelled veins in his temples, and such a strained skin to his face that it seemed to hold his eyes open and lift his eyebrows up. A man with a pervading appearance on him of being inflated like a balloon and ready to start. A man who could never sufficiently vaunt himself a self-made man. A man who was always proclaiming in that brassy, speaking trumpet of a voice of his old ignorance and his old poverty. A man who was the bully of humility.
That devastating description, delivered before Mr. Bounderby has uttered a word of his own, surely settles it. We interpret everything else Bounderby says or does in the light of what the narrator has told us. And on top of that, the narrator describes Bounderby's attitude to Mrs. Gradgrind in the paragraph just before their conversation.
In the formal drawing room of Stone Lodge, standing on the hearthrug, warming himself before the fire, Mr. Bounderby delivered some observations to Mrs. Gradgrind on the circumstance of its being his birthday. He stood before the fire, partly because it was a cool spring afternoon, though the sun shone, partly because the shade of Stone Lodge was always haunted by the ghost of damp mortar, partly because he thus took up a commanding position from which to subdue Mrs. Gradgrind.
I hadn't a shoe to my foot. As to a stocking, I didn't know such a thing by name. I passed the day in a ditch and the night in a pigsty. That's the way I spent my 10th birthday. Not that a ditch was new to me, for I was born in a ditch.
But it was a dry ditch.
No, as wet as a sop. A foot of water in it.
Enough to give a baby cold.
Cold? I was born with inflammation of the lungs. And of everything else, I believe, that was capable of inflammation. For years, ma'am, I was one of the most miserable little wretches ever seen. I was so sickly, I was always moaning and groaning. I was so ragged and dirty, you wouldn't have touched me with a pair of tongs. How I fought my way through it, I don't know. I was determined, I suppose. I have been a determined character in later life, and I suppose I was then. Oh, here I am, Mrs. Gradgrind, anyhow, and no one to thank for my being here but myself.
I hope that your mother...
My mother? Bolted, ma'am. My mother left me to my grandmother. And according to the best of my remembrance, my grandmother was the wickedest and the worst old woman who ever lived. If I got a little pair of shoes by any chance, she would take 'em off and sell 'em for drink. Why, I've known that grandmother of mine lie in her bed and drink her 14 glasses of liquor before breakfast.
Did you notice how Bounderby's language gets progressively more absurd and more boastful in order to match the narrator's original description? But what about Mrs. Gradgrind? Listen carefully to what the narrator says about her.
Mrs. Gradgrind, a little, thin, white, pink-eyed bundle of shawls, of surpassing feebleness, mental and bodily, who was always taking physic without any effect, and who, whenever she showed a symptom of coming to life, was invariably stunned by some weighty piece of fact tumbling on her. Mrs. Gradgrind hoped it was a dry ditch.
No, as wet as a sop. A foot of water in it,
said Mr. Bounderby.
Enough to give a baby cold.
Mrs. Gradgrind considered.
Cold? I was born with inflammation of the lungs. And of everything else, I believe, that was capable of inflammation.
Returned Mr. Bounderby.
Again, the description's brutally unambiguous, isn't it? And did you notice the trick the narrator plays on us? He gives Mrs. Gradgrind only one sentence of direct speech. He speaks the rest for her. So we had to cheat a bit and give her more direct speech in order to make those opening dialogues possible. But how does all this contribute to narrative structure, to the control of narrative expectation? Well, the typical effect of a dialogue between characters is to open up a problem or a relationship that points to the future. An argument or a conflict is left unsettled. We're curious about the outcome. Putting aside Bounderby for a moment, what about Mrs. Gradgrind? Her exchange with him could hardly be called a conflict. We wouldn't be surprised if such a character had very little future in the novel. Can we really be curious about somebody who's been presented to us as feeble as she is? What does she contribute to the onward movement of the story? Listen again to the words the narrator uses to bring home to us the extent of her feebleness and exactly why.
Mrs. Gradgrind, whenever she showed a symptom of coming to life, was invariably stunned by some weighty piece of fact tumbling on her.
These words take us right back to the beginning of the novel, to the initial presentation of Mr. Gradgrind as the austere philosopher of fact.
Now, what I want is facts. Teach these boys and girls nothing but facts. Facts alone are wanted in life. Plant nothing else and root out everything else. You can only form the minds of reasoning animals upon facts. Nothing else will ever be of any service to them. This is the principle on which I bring up my own children, and this is the principle upon which I bring up these children. Stick to facts, sir.
Mrs. Gradgrind is being perpetually stunned by some weighty piece of fact tumbling upon her. Her condition is the direct result of her husband's educational philosophy, of his attitude to human relationships. So the way she's presented in the scene with Bounderby makes sense in the light of what we've heard about her husband. The question, what happens next then, the one that underlies all narratives, has here been momentarily set aside by the question, why? And this in its turn alters our expectations about Mrs. Gradgrind's future. She's been cast in the role of victim. Contemptible, yes, but pathetic as well.
Give a baby cold.
Cold?
The brief note of pathos in that scene lays the basis for the later scene of Mrs. Gradgrind's death, where again the narrator confounds our expectations. Here's Mrs. Gradgrind's last conversation with Louisa just before she dies.
There is something, not an ology at all, that your father has missed or forgotten, Louisa. I don't know what it is. I've often sat with Sissy near me and thought about it. I shall never get its name now, but your father may. Makes me restless. I want to write to him to find out, for God's sake, what it is. Give me a pen. Give me a pen.
Even the power of restlessness was gone, except from the poor head, which could just turn from side to side. She fancied, however, that her request had been complied with, and that the pen she could not have held was in her hand. It matters little what figures of wonderful no meaning she began to trace upon her wrappers. The hand soon stopped in the midst of them. The light that had always been feeble and dim behind the weak transparency went out. And even Mrs. Gradgrind emerged from the shadow in which man walketh and disquieteth himself in vain, took upon her the dread solemnity of the sages and the patriarchs.
Mrs. Gradgrind is finally allowed to have some human dignity. Her death represents the novel's most radical attack upon the philosophy of fact, on the grounds of its being a denial of a significant life to living human beings, which, paradoxically, the fact of death can restore. What this should bring out is that narrative, what happens next, isn't simply a linear series, a progression of one event after another, this happened, this happened, this happened, and so on. Mrs. Gradgrind's progression from life to death represents one such linear series, one narrative thread, but it doesn't exist on its own. Gradgrind's philosophy of fact, to put it crudely, kills people. It kills Mrs. Gradgrind, and perhaps it may kill her daughter too.
This is the principle on which I bring up my own children, and this is the principle upon which I bring up these children. Stick to facts, sir.
These opening sentences suggest a possible fate for Louisa. She too is a Gradgrind. She faces the prospect of being equally stunned by fact through her marriage to Mr. Bounderby, Gradgrind's friend. Listen to this exchange between father and daughter, read from chapter 15.
Louisa, it appears to me that nothing can be plainer. Confining yourself rigidly to fact, the question of fact you state to yourself is, does Mr. Bounderby ask me to marry him? Yes, he does. The sole remaining question then is, shall I marry him? I think nothing can be plainer than that.
Shall I marry him?
Precisely. And it is satisfactory to me as your father, my dear Louisa, to know that you do not come to the consideration of the question with the previous habits of mind and habits of life that belong to many young women.
No, Father, I do not.
I now leave you to judge for yourself. I have stated the case, as such cases are usually stated among practical minds. I have stated it, as the case of your mother and myself was stated in its time. The rest, my dear Louisa, is for you to decide.
Looking back to that scene between Bounderby and Mrs. Gradgrind, there are really two narrative threads, Mrs. Gradgrind's and, by implication, Louisa's. And that's true of all novels. Hard Times offers a complex of narratives that jostle together, interrupting, diverting, redirecting each other, and affecting our sense of what each amounts to. The intertwining of the two questions, what next and why, what keeps the story moving, why does it move in a particular way, is a feature of all narrative. But individual novelists develop their distinctive style by the different ways in which they combine the two questions. Now, I've been talking so far about the formal structure of narrative, but no story exists on its own. Always there's a storyteller. Always there is an audience, whether listeners or readers. In the case of Hard Times, Dickens wrote it for serial publication in a periodical called Household Words, which he edited. Each installment consisted of 2 or 3 chapters, leading to a cliffhanger ending with a heavily underlined what next narrative question. Remember also that Dickens's work was commonly read aloud, whether by himself on public occasions or, as the title Household Words suggests, at home for family consumption. Those famous comic set pieces seem ideal for such occasions, that piling up of linguistic jokes, one absurdity leading to another in effects of wonderful mounting extravagance. To give you an example, here's our narrator reading the rest of Bounderby's boastful monologue.
My mother left me to my grandmother, said Bounderby, and according to the best of my remembrance, my grandmother was the wickedest and the worst old woman that ever lived. If I got a little pair of shoes by any chance, she would take them off and sell them for drink. Why, I have known that grandmother of mine lie in her bed and drink her 14 glasses of liquor before breakfast. Mrs. Gradgrind, weakly smiling and giving no other sign of vitality, looked, as she always did, like an indifferently executed transparency of a small female figure without enough light behind it. She kept a chandler's shop, pursued Bounderby, and kept me in an egg box. That was the cot of my infancy, an old egg box. As soon as I was big enough to run away, of course I ran away. Then I became a young vagabond. And instead of one old woman knocking me about and starving me, everybody of all ages knocked me about and starved me. They were right. They had no business to do anything else. I was a nuisance, an encumbrance, and a pest. I know that very well. His pride in having at any time of his life achieved such a great social distinction as to be a nuisance, an encumbrance, and a pest, was only to be satisfied by 3 sonorous repetitions of the boast. I was to pull through it, I suppose, Mrs. Gradgrind. Whether I was to do it or not, ma'am, I did it. I pulled through it, though nobody threw me out a rope. Vagabond, errand boy, vagabond, laborer, porter, clerk, chief manager, small partner, Josiah Bounderby of Coketown. Those are the antecedents and the culmination. Josiah Bounderby of Coketown learnt his letters from the outsides of the shops, Mrs. Gradgrind, and was first able to tell the time upon a dial plate from studying the steeple clock of St. Giles's Church, London, under the direction of a drunken cripple who was a convicted thief and an incorrigible vagrant. Tell Josiah Bounderby of Coketown of your district schools and your model schools and your training schools and your whole kettle of fish of schools. And Josiah Bounderby of Coketown tells you plainly, all right, all correct, he hadn't such advantages. But let us have hard-headed, solid-fisted people. The education that made him won't do for everybody, he knows well. But such and such his education was, however, and you may force him to swallow boiling fat, but you shall never force him to suppress the facts of his life. Being heated, when he arrived at this climax, Josiah Bounderby of Coketown stopped. He stopped just as his eminently practical friend, still accompanied by the 2 young culprits, entered the room. His eminently practical friend, on seeing him, stopped also, and gave Louisa a reproachful look that plainly said, "Behold your Bounderby." "Well," blustered Mr. Bounderby, "what's the matter? What is young Thomas in the dumps about?" He spoke of young Thomas, but he looked at Louisa.
Remember the narrator's opening remark that Bounderby was the bully of humility. The speech we've just heard is Dickens' comic way of spelling out just what that means. Yet even here we can still ask the formal narrative question: how does the speech keep the story moving along? And the clue lies in Bounderby's claim that he will never be forced to suppress the facts of his life. But what is the truth about Bounderby? His account of his childhood is a pack of lies. We need to wait to the end of the novel to discover this, but in the course of it, Dickens gives us a number of clues in the shape of the unexplained appearances of a mysterious old woman outside Bounderby's house. It's a kind of narrative joke against Bounderby. We began the program with Umberto Eco's claim that all novels were detective novels, the search for, the unearthing of some secret, hidden truth. And clearly there's a lot of that in Hard Times. Whether it's the kind of detective novel that Umberto Eco claims is something I'll leave you to decide.
The novel of detection is a very metaphysical one, or it represents the popular way in which people can feel the shudder of metaphysical problems.